If you remember many of the Old Testament stories, you will remember that they begin in the wilderness. Our forebears in faith were no stranger to wilderness journeys. It was into the wilderness that God brought the children of Israel after their deliverance from Egypt. And for 40 years they were there. And it was while they were in that wilderness that God tended them by day by day. God provided for them. God provided manna and quail and water, all of their daily bread. And God provided protection from their enemies. And it was also in the wilderness where God constituted Israel as a people set apart to God. It was there that God provided the Decalogue, that is the 10 Commandments, so that God's people would no longer live as slaves of one another. Instead, they became the people of God, free and fearless in God's presence. It was in the wilderness that God's people learned to depend on God alone, not just for daily bread, but also for the words that came from God. And it was there in the wilderness that God's people realized that God alone was sufficient. They came to understand that God alone could be depended upon. It was in the wilderness that God's people found themselves. The season of Lent we often think of as a wilderness time. And we think of it as an opportunity for us to come face to face with our mortality. We mark the beginning of Lent with ashes, and we say, "Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return." It is a 40-day trek that may not lead us directly from point A to point B. Many of us, I expect, took on Lent disciplines for this season. We began to, was it to pray more, to read scripture more, to attend worship more, to be more generous in our stewardship? Was it to feed the hungry? Was it to volunteer at SCCM? Or was it to be kinder, to be more intentional about how we show the love of God to other people? And now we are about 10 days into that journey. And I expect you can agree that you don't always get a direct line to point B from point A. Sometimes there is a bit of wandering. Perhaps we know exactly where we are, but we're not quite certain how to get to the place where we want to be. Perhaps we are certain we have most of what we need, but we are not sure how best to use what we have. Perhaps in our wilderness we are surrounded by people, yet we are clothed in loneliness. Perhaps the questions outnumber the answers. Perhaps the wilderness is of our own making. Or perhaps the wilderness comes unbidden to us. Certainly, the wilderness is different for every person. Yet together as a community of faith, we come as a community. We come as a community of people trusting in the power of the living Christ. Where have you faced wilderness in the past week or the past month or the past year? What have you found in the wilderness? Have you found the one on whom you can truly depend? Have you found strength that you would not have expected? Have you experienced generosity that you could never have imagined? Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. The Gospel of Luke reminds us of that over and over again. Beginning in the very first chapter of Luke, we are told that the rich are sent away empty, but the hungry are filled. We are shown that sinners catch the eye of Jesus, that the powerless are lifted up, the sick are made well, the powerful are toppled, the outcast are included, and women and children find their place in the story. Now, some of you may be able to name your wilderness, but sometimes it's difficult to name our own wilderness. Perhaps it's easier to name the wilderness of our child or our parent or our spouse. As we heard and saw the story of Zacchaeus enacted this morning, it is quite possible for us to point out at least one wilderness. At the very least, Zacchaeus was lost in his greed. As a chief tax collector, you see, he could charge whatever he wanted. If a person's tax bill was 20 denarii, he could add on top of that whatever he wanted to add, and the person was bound to pay it. Zacchaeus, it seems, had sold his soul to the Roman government. The people from whom he collected tax were not pleased about that. It's no wonder that he was wealthy, because he could take 3 times or 4 times or 5 times as much money as he would end up handing over to the government. And it is no wonder that he was shunned by his neighbors, disregarded, and always treated as an outsider. Scripture describes Zacchaeus as a small man, and so we have come to think of him as short in stature. But the Greek word, the Greek adjective, which is translated small, may instead relate to his role in society. Zacchaeus may have been small primarily because of his despised profession. But if you listen carefully to the text, you know that Zacchaeus is not the only one who has at least 1 foot in the wilderness. His neighbors, that is the crowd, the ones from whom Zacchaeus extracts revenue, were mired down in their judgments. It seems they may have conspired to keep Zacchaeus from seeing Jesus. And they certainly cried out at the perceived injustice as Jesus goes home with Zacchaeus, a sinner in their eyes. And so they grumble. They grumble against the generosity of Jesus. Now, what we can't know, and Scripture really gives no hint of this, is why Zacchaeus was so eager to see Jesus. Do you suppose he wanted to meet Jesus? Or maybe he just hoped to see him? But when Jesus sees him high up in the tree, Zacchaeus offers Jesus hospitality. And that bite of bread, that loaf of bread, that time spent at his home with Jesus changed Zacchaeus dramatically. And so he stands up without any provocation, as we can tell, and says that he will repay more than he has taken. The unconditional grace Zacchaeus receives from Jesus is to be returned fourfold. We don't know much about the crowd after they saw Jesus. Did they continue to live into their judgment? Did they continue to hold on to their righteous indignation? Were they ever able to forgive Zacchaeus? Were they ever able to experience the unconditional grace Jesus offered? I expect it's true that most of us, much of the time, live with one foot in the wilderness and one foot in the land of God's abundance. As 1 Corinthians says, we know in part, but then we will fully understand. And it is true, in our own wildernesses, we see a glimpse of the truth, and then we return to the darkness. We may experience the love of God through another person, and then we are bombarded with negativity from ourselves or from others. We may hear a line of a hymn or a verse of scripture. We may taste the bread and the cup. We may experience the joy of community and the light of Christ. There may be a timely phone call. Any of them may call us out of our wilderness and into the abundant generosity and grace of God. And so as we trudge through the wilderness, or as we climb a tree for a better view, or as we hang on to just a shred of hope for a moment, or for a day, or for months at a time, we must remember that we do not travel alone. Jesus, who came to save the least and the lost, Jesus, the one who beckoned Zacchaeus from the upper branches of the tree, Jesus, the one who says, "You are mine, I will never let you go." Jesus, the one who runs to welcome the prodigal home, is the one who offers unconditional love. Whether we are in the wilderness at this moment, or whether we have our feet both planted in the land of God's abundance, it is important for us to remember that we worship a God of abundant generosity, a God of unconditional love, a God who holds us and will never let us go. In the wilderness, Zacchaeus met the one who would give him life. In the wilderness, the grumbling crowd experienced the presence of Jesus. And so, my friends, in our own wilderness season, wilderness seasons, wilderness moments, in all of our wilderness, the risen Christ is there with us, providing, as God did in the wilderness for his people, manna from heaven, the bread of life, and living water. Thanks be to God.